Hello, beautiful listeners. Today, I would like to whisper to you a sleep story that I have written, and in doing so, I'm going to take you back to the 15th and 16th centuries to discuss a topic which actually a topic and a period of time that was highly important for cultural development in the West. By the end of this video, if you have not fallen asleep, which is perfectly okay, you will understand what Renaissance humanism is, and even a little more about what the Renaissance is, why Renaissance humanism was impactful, and how this was reflected in some famous Renaissance art. If you fall asleep, you can find timestamps in the description box and pinned in the first comment, so you can continue the story as you wish. So, wherever you are, get comfortable, take a few deep, calming breaths, and we will begin. So, just before we get into Renaissance humanism, I would like to explain to you what the Renaissance was. Now, because we are being transported back in time today, I have printed out this story on paper, so we should hopefully get some nice paper sounds as I read to you the sleep story. So, we are probably all familiar to some extent with the Renaissance period. Most of us have heard of important Renaissance figures such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo and Galileo Galilei. But I will take just a minute to define the era properly and give you some understanding of what life was like in this period. So the Renaissance marked a diversion from medieval life and began in Italy. The Renaissance was a fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political and economic rebirth following the Middle Ages. Generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century, the Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature and art. Some of the greatest thinkers, authors, statesmen, scientists and artists in human history thrived during this era, while global exploration opened up new lands and cultures to European commerce. The Renaissance is credited with bridging the gap between the Middle Ages and modern-day civilization. The Dark and Middle Ages followed the downfall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, and there was very few advances in science, philosophy and art in that period. There is some debate among scholars about whether the Dark Ages were as grim as is generally presented, but this is not the topic of this video. For some discussion of what that period was like, I do actually cover some of it in my History of Soap video, so do check that out at some point if you're interested. Anyway, whatever the reality was, the emergence of humanism in the 14th century was the driving force towards cultural development in Europe and was the end of the Middle Ages. So I'm just going to pause the story for a moment to tell you why I am making this video today. I'm taking part in a collaboration with other artists, hosted by the talented Sounds Curious ASMR, and I'm going to link you to them in the description of this video. Many of us are making videos on the topic of the Renaissance, and you can find the link to the playlist again in the description of this video. We are doing staggered video releases, and it's possible other artists are going to join in later, so do keep an eye out on that playlist for more videos being uploaded on the topic of the Renaissance. This is going to be a really interesting project. I think we're calling it the ASMR Renaissance Project. So if you're interested in that period, or just in general, I think definitely check it out. Anyway, let's continue with the sleep story. So let's look at the emergence of humanism. In the 14th century, a cultural movement called Humanism started to gain momentum in Italy and was embraced by scholars, writers and civic leaders in 14th and early 15th century Italy. During the medieval period, the educational conventions emphasised practical, pre-professional and scientific studies engaged in solely for job preparation and typically by men alone. Humanists reacted against this utilitarian approach, seeking to create a citizenry who were able to speak and write with eloquence, and thus able to engage the civic life of their communities. This was to be accomplished through the study of the Studia Humanitatis, known today as the humanities, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry and moral philosophy. Humanism introduced a programme to revive the cultural and particularly the literary legacy and moral philosophy of classical antiquity. The movement was largely founded on the ideals of Italian scholar and poet Francesco Petrarca, which were often centred around humanity's potential for achievement. In fact, the invention of the Gutenberg printing press in 1450 allowed for improved communication throughout Europe and for ideas to spread more quickly. And a direct consequence of this was that little-known texts from early humanist authors, including Petrarca and also Giovanni Boccaccio, which promoted the renewal of traditional Greek and Roman culture and values, were printed and distributed to the masses. Additionally, many scholars believe advances in international finance and trade impacted culture in Europe and set the stage for the Renaissance in general. While humanism initially began as a predominantly literary movement, its influence quickly pervaded the general culture of the time, reintroducing classical Greek and Roman art forms and contributing to the development of the Renaissance. Humanists considered the ancient world to be the pinnacle of human achievement and thought its accomplishments should serve as the model for contemporary Europe. There were important centres of humanism in Florence, Naples, Rome, Venice, Genoa, Mantua, Ferrara and Urbino. Some of the first humanists were great collectors of antique manuscripts, including Petrarca and Boccaccio, but also Coluccio Salutati and Poggio Bracciolione. Sorry for the mispronunciation that I'm probably doing for these Italian names. Many humanist Renaissance figures worked for the organised church and were in holy orders, which means holy orders I think is like the priesthood, while others were lawyers and chancellors of Italian cities. Humanism was an optimistic philosophy that saw man as a rational and sentient being with the ability to decide and think for himself or herself. It saw man as inherently good by nature, which was in tension and contrast with the Christian view of man as the original sinner needing redemption, and in fact being born with sin. It provided fresh insight into the nature of reality, questioning beyond God and spirituality, and provided knowledge about history beyond Christian history. I personally believe that humanism was a force for good in terms of our cultural development, and this move away from purely Christian values and history was the driving force behind scientific advancement and the development of our society today. In Italy, the humanist educational program won rapid acceptance, and by the mid-15th century, many of the upper classes had received humanist educations, possibly in addition to traditional scholastic ones. Some of the highest officials of the church were humanists, with the resources to amass important libraries, such as Cardinal Basilius Bessarion, a convert to the Latin Church from Greek Orthodoxy, who was considered for the papacy, which means to be pope, or popehood, I suppose. And he was one of the most learned scholars of his time. Following the Crusader sacking of Constantinople and the end of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, the migration of the Byzantine Greek scholars and emigres, who had great familiarity with ancient languages and works, furthered the revival of Greek and Roman literature and science. So, let's talk about humanist art, which is the last section of this sleep story, but it's quite a large section, so don't worry. Renaissance humanists saw no conflict between their study of the ancients and Christianity. The lack of perceived conflict allowed early Renaissance artists to combine classical forms, classical themes, and Christian theology freely. Early Renaissance sculpture is a great vehicle to explore the emerging Renaissance style. The leading artists of this medium were Donatello, Filippo Brunelleschi, and Lorenzo Ghiberti. Donatello became renowned as the greatest sculptor of the early Renaissance, known especially for his classical and unusually erotic statue of David, which became one of the icons of the Florentine Republic. David, of course, is a figure from the Bible, I think Old Testament. This is not to be confused, by the way, with Michelangelo's David. Donatello's David is a bronze figure which is nude except for helmet and boots, and dates to around the year 1440. Michelangelo's David, on the other hand, is a marble structure and was created between 1501 and 1504. In fact, I think Donatello sculpted two Davids, but the bronze figure is much more famous. Both Donatello and Michelangelo's Davids figures are incredibly famous pieces of Renaissance art. Humanism affected the artistic community and how artists were perceived. While medieval society viewed artists as servants and craftspeople, Renaissance artists were trained intellectuals, and their art reflected this newfound point of view. Patronage of the arts became an important activity, and commissions included secular subject matter as well as religious. Important patrons, such as Cosimo de' Medici, emerged and contributed largely to the expanding artistic production of the time. The Medici family, by the way, were very powerful and influential, and they ruled Florence for more than 60 years. And also, they were very famous backers of the Renaissance movement in general. In painting, the treatment of the elements of perspective and light became of particular concern. Paolo Uccello, for example, who was best known for the Battle of San Romano, was obsessed by his interest in perspective and would stay up all night in his study trying to grasp the exact vanishing point. He used perspective in order to create a feeling of depth in his paintings. In addition, the use of oil paint had its beginnings in the early part of the 16th century, and its use continued to be explored extensively throughout the High Renaissance. The High Renaissance being the period from the 1490s to the 1520s. The best known painters of this period were Michelangelo, Da Vinci and Raphael. But let's explore two examples of humanist Renaissance art. The first is the Primavera, which was painted in the late 1470s to the early 1480s and was painted by Sandro Botticelli. This famous early Renaissance painting depicts figures from classical mythology: the god Mercury plucking a golden fruit from a tree, the three graces dancing together, and Venus, the goddess of love, at the centre with Primavera, the goddess of spring, to her left. The meaning of the mysterious scene, located within a woodland garden, has been much debated by scholars, and it has been viewed as an allegory, a depiction of various scenes from the writing of the Roman post-Ovid, or as a purely aesthetic arrangement. At the same time, some critics have deeply analysed the work, finding its elements, including the hundreds of specific flowers naturalistically depicted, as reflective as Neoplatonic thought. Neoplatonism emphasised ideal love and absolute beauty as reflections of the ideal forms posited by the Greek philosopher Plato. A sense of the hidden and sublime order of the world that, while pagan, was not inconsistent with Christianity, is shown in the artist's central figure that simultaneously evokes Venus and the Virgin Mary. Botticelli's use of mythological subjects and his near-nude female figures were groundbreaking. As an art critic, Jonathan Jones puts it, Botticelli's Primavera was one of the first large-scale European paintings to tell a story that was not Christian, replacing the agony of Easter with the pagan rite. The very idea of art as a pleasure and not a sermon began in this meadow. Botticelli was particularly influenced by Dante, the early Renaissance poet, whose Platonic love for Beatrice informed his Divina Commedia, Divine Comedy, in 1301 to 1321, depicting his journey through hell and purgatory to paradise. The artist drew illustrations and wrote commentary on the famous poet's work. Associated with the artistic and intellectual circles around Lorenzo de' Medici, the artist was influenced by Marsilio Ficino. Later in his career, as Florence was roiled by the rise of Savonarola, a priest who railed against pagan art and influences, Botticelli refuted his early subjects and began to focus on a series of illustrations depicting Dante's version of the suffering souls in hell and purgatory. Though his art fell into relative obscurity, it was subsequently rediscovered in the 19th century, and his paintings have become amongst the most recognisable artworks, reproduced in countless advertisements, brochures and digital platforms. The second piece of art we will look at is The Vetruvian Man, circa 1485, by Leonardo da Vinci. It is likely you have seen this, or representations of this, before. This drawing shows the ideally proportioned figure of a man in two superimposed positions, standing within a circle and a square. Due to the superimposition of poses and geometric forms, the symmetrical and balanced figure evokes kinetic movement, while the drawing feels almost three-dimensional, as if the viewer were looking into a volumetric geometric space. Often called the canon of proportions, and also known as the proportions of the human body according to Vitruvius. The drawing and Leonardo's accompanying text reference the mathematical proportions of the Roman innovator. In the upper margin, Leonardo paraphrases from Book 3 of Vitruvius's De Architectura, writing, Vitruvio, architect, puts in his work on architecture that the measurements of man are in nature distributed in this manner. While in the lower text, Leonardo draws upon the architect's proportions but corrects them according to his own anatomical studies. Leonardo shared the architect's belief that the proportions of the human body were a kind of microcosm of the symmetry and order of the universe. Other Renaissance artists drew the human figure according to Vitruvian proportions, but Leonardo innovatively drew upon his own study of human anatomy, as he realised that the centre of the square had to be located at the groin rather than at the navel, as Vitruvius thought, and that the raised arm should be level with the top of the head. Combining scientific knowledge and mathematical study with the aesthetic principles of ideal proportion and beauty, the drawing exemplified Renaissance humanism, seeing the individual as the centre of the natural world, linking the earthly realm, symbolised by the square, to the divine circle, symbolising oneness. Later artists have continued to draw upon the image for inspiration, as seen in William Blake's Glad Day or The Dance of Albion, and Nat Crate's Vetruvian Woman. We have reached the end of tonight's sleep story. As ever, please find references for this work